"You're here to ask for money again, aren't you?" the receptionist said before I even reached the front desk. That was the first sentence I heard when I walked into the building that used to define my entire life. My name is Ethan Carter, and I didn't come here for what they thought I came for. I stepped through the glass doors of Hale Brooks Corporate Center in downtown Chicago on a cold Monday morning, the kind of morning where the wind cuts through your coat and reminds you exactly how small you are in a city that never slows down. People in the lobby barely looked up, but when they did, I could see it instantly in their eyes: assumption, judgment, dismissal. To them, I wasn't someone with purpose. I was someone with a problem. The receptionist repeated herself louder this time, as if volume would make her assumption more correct, and a few nearby employees exchanged quiet smiles like they had already decided my entire story before I said a word. I didn't correct them. I didn't argue. I just stood there for a moment, taking in the space. The polished marble floors, the corporate logo glowing behind the front desk, the expensive suits moving like they owned every inch of air in the room. Years ago, I used to walk these same halls with a different name attached to me, a different weight in their eyes, but memory has a way of becoming invisible to people who choose convenience over truth. I reached into my coat and felt the edge of a folder I had carried across 3 states, not because it was fragile, but because what was inside it mattered more than anything I had ever held before. The receptionist leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice into something almost pitying. "If you're here to request financial assistance, you need to fill out a form downstairs." That was when I finally looked at her, not with anger, but with calm that made her pause mid-sentence. Calm is something people rarely recognize as dangerous until it is too late. Behind her, through the glass walls, I could see the executive floor where decisions were made that never reached people like me unless we were the subject of them. Somewhere in that building, Victoria Hale was preparing for a meeting she believed would go exactly as planned, and Daniel Brooks was likely laughing about how predictable the world had become. They both believed the same thing everyone else in this lobby believed, that I had nothing left to stand on. I slowly placed the folder on the counter, not opening it yet, not revealing anything, just letting its presence sit between us like a quiet interruption in their certainty. The receptionist glanced at it briefly, then back at me, still unconvinced that I belonged anywhere near decisions that mattered. That was the moment everything began, though none of them understood it yet. Because I didn't come here to ask for anything. I came here because what they thought they had taken from me was never theirs to keep, and today, they were going to learn exactly how wrong they had been about me from the very beginning. The folder stayed on the counter longer than it should have, like an object everyone could see but no one wanted to understand. The receptionist finally picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it might stain her hands, and glanced at the plain label on the front. Ethan Carter. Nothing else. No company logo. No title. Just a name she clearly did not recognize or care to place anywhere important. Around us, the lobby kept moving, phones ringing softly, elevators opening and closing with quiet precision, people walking past as if I were part of the furniture that did not belong. I noticed a security guard shift his stance slightly, not aggressive, just observant, the way someone watches a situation they expect to end quickly. The receptionist sighed and leaned toward the phone, preparing to call someone who would likely remove me before I could explain anything. That was when I spoke again, not louder, not faster, just steady. I told her I was not here for assistance, and for a brief second her hand stopped moving. She looked at me differently, not with respect, but with uncertainty, because people like her are trained to categorize quickly, and I no longer fit the category she had prepared. Before she could respond, the elevator doors behind her opened and a small group of executives stepped out, dressed in tailored suits, speaking in low confident tones about numbers and timelines that sounded important enough to control other people's lives. Among them was Victoria Hale. She stopped walking the moment her eyes landed on me. There was no recognition at first, only confusion, followed by a slow tightening of her expression as memory tried to place my face in a past she had already decided to move on from. Daniel Brooks followed behind her, smiling at something someone had just said, until he noticed the silence forming in Victoria's posture. That was when his eyes shifted to me. The smile did not disappear immediately, but it changed, like it had been interrupted mid-performance. I did not move. I did not greet them. I simply stood there, letting the distance between who they thought I was and who I actually was grow heavier with each passing second. Victoria finally spoke my name, but it sounded less like acknowledgement and more like a question she wished she had not asked. "Ethan Carter," she said slowly, as if testing whether saying it out loud would make it real. Daniel stepped forward slightly, glancing at the receptionist, then back at me, already trying to reconstruct a story where I made sense in a place like this. I could see it in their faces now, not understanding, but discomfort. The kind of discomfort that appears when certainty begins to crack. I placed my hand on the counter and gently pulled the folder back toward me, not opening it yet, just reclaiming control over something they had not even realized they were losing. I told them I had come to speak with both of them, not as a request, but as a necessity. The air in the lobby shifted in a way that was not visible but deeply felt, as conversations nearby slowed and attention drifted without permission. Victoria crossed her arms, trying to regain authority through posture, while Daniel's gaze narrowed as he tried to anticipate the direction this moment was heading. Neither of them spoke immediately, because the silence itself had started working against them. And in that silence, I realized something simple but important: they were no longer looking at me as someone who did not belong. They were starting to realize I might have been here all along, waiting for the exact moment they could no longer ignore me. Victoria Hale held her posture as if it were the only thing keeping the moment under control, but I could see the tension in the way her fingers pressed lightly against her own arm. The lobby had grown quieter now, not empty, but attentive in the way people become when they sense something unusual is happening but do not yet understand what it is. Daniel Brooks stepped closer to Victoria, lowering his voice as if trying to anchor the situation back into something familiar, something manageable, but his eyes kept returning to me like I was a variable he could not solve. The receptionist still stood behind the counter holding the folder I had placed there, unsure whether she was supposed to return it or continue pretending it was not important. I finally looked directly at Victoria and spoke calmly, telling her I did not come here to interrupt her schedule or disrupt her day, but that I had come because there were matters that had been left unresolved for far too long. She responded with a controlled smile that did not reach her eyes, asking what exactly I believed I was entitled to, and in that question I could hear the assumption that I had arrived with confusion rather than clarity. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I glanced around the space, taking in the glass walls, the polished surfaces, the structured order of a company that believed order meant truth. Daniel let out a small breath and tried to reframe the moment by suggesting that any concerns I had could be directed through formal channels, as if I were still outside their system and needed permission to enter it. That was when I opened the folder for the first time. The sound of paper moving was quiet, but it carried more weight than anything else in the room. I placed the documents on the counter one by one, not rushing, not emphasizing, just letting them exist. Victoria's eyes followed the papers, and for the first time her expression shifted from controlled irritation to something closer to concern. Daniel leaned slightly forward, scanning the top page, and I could see the exact moment his confidence faltered, not dramatically, but subtly, like a structure realizing it had been built on assumptions instead of certainty. I explained in a steady voice that the documents represented agreements, transactions, and transfers that had been made years ago, agreements that connected directly to my name and my history with the organization they now represented. I did not raise my voice, because there was no need to compete with noise when truth was already present. Victoria asked me if I truly believed I could challenge what had already been finalized, and her tone carried a blend of disbelief and dismissal, as if the idea itself was unreasonable. I responded that finalization does not erase ownership, and ownership does not disappear simply because time has passed or because people have chosen to ignore it. Daniel finally spoke more sharply, suggesting that whatever I was claiming had no standing, but his words lacked the confidence he had entered the room with. The receptionist, still watching, quietly set the folder down as if it had become too heavy to hold. Around us, employees at nearby desks had stopped typing, pretending to continue working while clearly listening. I noticed Victoria glance toward the executive floor, perhaps considering whether to escalate the situation or end it quickly, but neither option felt stable anymore. I told them both that I was not interested in arguments or interpretations, only an acknowledgement of what was already documented. For the first time, neither of them responded immediately, because the situation had shifted into something they could no longer dismiss as simple misunderstanding. It was not yet resolution, but it was no longer ignorance either, and that space in between was where control begins to slip. The silence after I placed the documents on the counter did not last long, but it changed everything about the room. Victoria Hale finally reached for the papers, her movements precise but slower than before, as if each page might confirm something she was not ready to face. Daniel Brooks stayed close to her side, reading over her shoulder, his expression tightening with every line he processed. I watched them carefully, not with satisfaction, but with the calm awareness that truth does not need to be loud to become unavoidable. Victoria turned a page, then another, and I could see her confidence begin to fragment in small visible ways, like cracks forming under pressure that had been ignored for too long. She asked me where I had obtained the documents, her voice still controlled but less certain, and I answered simply that I did not obtain them recently, I had preserved them. That distinction mattered more than she wanted to admit. Daniel interrupted, insisting that records like these would have been reviewed and settled years ago, but even as he spoke, his eyes kept returning to specific clauses that he could not easily dismiss. I remained still, allowing them to move through the information at their own pace, because urgency often reveals more than explanation ever could. Around us, the lobby staff had shifted their attention fully now, pretending to work while clearly following every detail. The receptionist leaned slightly forward, as if trying to understand how something that seemed ordinary at first had become so significant. Victoria stepped back half a step, then steadied herself, placing the documents back on the counter as if distance might restore clarity. She asked me directly what I expected to happen next, and there was an attempt in her tone to regain authority through control of direction. I told her I expected nothing except recognition of what was already established. Daniel let out a short, controlled laugh, suggesting that even if my claims had historical relevance, legal and corporate processes would prevent any sudden change. But his confidence no longer matched the situation, and even he seemed aware of that disconnect. I reached into the folder again, this time pulling out a single page that had been highlighted and signed in multiple places. I placed it on top of the stack without pushing it toward them, letting it rest where it was visible but not forced. Victoria looked down at it and became very still. For a brief moment, she did not speak, and the absence of her voice carried more weight than any argument. Daniel finally picked up the page, reading it more carefully now, and I could see his expression shift from skepticism to reluctant recognition that the structure he trusted was not as simple as he had believed. I explained, in the same steady tone, that this was not a matter of interpretation, but a matter of record, and records do not change because people forget them. Victoria asked quietly if I had been planning this moment for a long time, and I answered that I had not planned the moment itself, only ensured that the truth would still exist when the moment finally arrived. That answer seemed to unsettle her more than anything else, because it removed emotion from the equation entirely. Daniel set the page down carefully, as if treating it differently might change its meaning, but it did not. The receptionist slowly stepped away from the counter now, no longer trying to intervene, simply observing. I could feel the balance in the room shifting, not toward conflict, but toward realization, and realization is often the point where people begin to understand they are no longer in control of the narrative they assumed was theirs. The atmosphere in the lobby had shifted into something that felt heavier, not louder, but more concentrated, as if every person in the space had become aware that the situation was no longer routine. Victoria Hale stood still for several seconds after reviewing the page I had placed on top of the documents, her eyes fixed on a section that seemed to draw all of her attention away from everything else in the room. Daniel Brooks remained beside her, but his posture had changed, no longer relaxed or dismissive, now slightly rigid as he continued reading through the details with increasing focus. I did not move or speak, allowing them the time to reach their own understanding, because certain realizations cannot be forced without resistance. Victoria finally looked up from the document and asked me in a quieter voice what exactly I wanted from this situation, and for the first time there was no confidence in her tone, only uncertainty shaped by the possibility that she had misunderstood more than she had realized. I answered her calmly that I was not asking for anything beyond what had already been established in writing, and that my presence was only to ensure those terms were no longer ignored. Daniel immediately responded, suggesting that even if the document had validity, corporate review procedures and legal frameworks would require time and verification, but his words carried less certainty than before, as if he were now speaking to maintain structure rather than to assert control. I could see Victoria glance briefly toward the elevator bank again, not as a distraction, but as someone reconsidering the stability of the environment she had been standing in moments earlier. Around us, the lobby employees had stopped pretending to ignore the situation entirely, and the receptionist had moved further from the counter, watching in silence without interruption. I reached into the folder once more and removed a second set of papers, placing them beside the first without emphasis, letting the arrangement speak for itself. Victoria hesitated before touching them, as if expecting the act of confirmation to change their meaning, but when she finally reviewed them, her expression shifted into something more restrained and controlled, as though she was attempting to hold her reaction within professional boundaries. Daniel scanned the additional pages and then exhaled slowly, his attention lingering on a sequence of approvals and recorded transfers that connected directly across multiple years. I explained that the situation had never been about sudden claims, but about continuity, and continuity is often what people overlook when they assume time has erased responsibility. Victoria asked me again, more softly this time, how long I had been preparing for this moment, and I told her that preparation was not about anticipation, but about preservation, ensuring that facts remain intact even when they are no longer convenient. The silence that followed was not empty, but active, as if the room itself was adjusting to a revised understanding of what was in front of it. Daniel finally set the papers down carefully, no longer challenging their existence, but also not fully accepting the implications, suspended between two positions that no longer aligned comfortably. Victoria took a slow breath, straightened her posture, and for the first time acknowledged that this was not a misunderstanding that could be dismissed quickly. I did not advance the conversation further, because at this stage, words were no longer needed to establish direction. The documents were already doing what they were meant to do, and the only thing left was for the consequences of recognition to fully settle into place. The room no longer felt like it belonged to anyone in control, but rather like a space in transition, where certainty had already begun to leave and only acknowledgement remained unfinished. Victoria Hale stood with her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, her gaze moving between the documents and my face as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. Daniel Brooks had shifted slightly behind her, no longer speaking, no longer attempting to redirect the situation, simply observing with a measured silence that suggested he was recalculating rather than resisting. I remained in the same position, allowing the weight of what had already been presented to continue settling without interference. Victoria finally asked me in a steady but subdued tone what outcome I expected from all of this, and I responded that the outcome was not something I was creating in that moment, but something that had already existed in documentation long before any of us entered this building today. She nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition that pushing against that reality would no longer produce clarity. Daniel looked down at the papers again, this time more slowly, as if reading them not to challenge but to fully understand the structure they represented. A long pause followed, during which no one attempted to fill the silence, because it was no longer uncomfortable in the same way it had been earlier, but instead reflective, like a process nearing completion. I told them that I had no intention of turning the moment into confrontation, and that my only purpose was to ensure that what had been recorded and signed was no longer treated as invisible. Victoria exhaled softly and straightened her posture, then asked if there had ever been an attempt to address this matter previously, and I answered that attempts had been made in the past, but acknowledgement had always been delayed or redirected until it became easier for others to forget rather than resolve. Daniel finally spoke again, but his tone was no longer defensive, instead acknowledging that certain elements of the documentation would require formal review beyond their immediate assumptions. Around us, the lobby had returned to a quieter rhythm, though attention had not fully dispersed, as people continued to observe from a distance without intervening. The receptionist had returned to her position but remained unusually still, no longer attempting to categorize the situation into something routine. Victoria looked toward the elevator once more, then back at me, and there was a noticeable change in her expression, not acceptance yet, but a reduction in resistance, as if she had begun to understand that control in this situation was not something she could assert through position or tone. I did not pursue further explanation, because at this point explanation would have only repeated what the documents had already made clear. Instead, I simply waited, allowing the process of recognition to complete itself without pressure. Daniel placed the papers down gently and stepped back half a step, signaling not withdrawal, but recalibration. Victoria finally spoke again, saying that she would need time to review everything in detail, and I responded that time was already part of the structure I had prepared, and that nothing required acceleration beyond what had already been established. The moment did not end with resolution, but with alignment beginning to form where confusion had existed before, and that shift marked the point where the narrative of assumption could no longer remain unchanged. Victoria Hale finally stepped back from the counter, not in retreat, but in a controlled attempt to regain composure in a situation that no longer responded to her usual authority. The documents remained spread in front of her, but now she was no longer reading them with urgency. Only with careful attention, as if trying to separate emotion from fact. Hale Brooks stood beside her, no longer attempting to interpret the situation for her benefit, instead focusing on the structure of the papers as though searching for any remaining uncertainty he could reasonably question. I stayed where I was, not advancing, not withdrawing, simply maintaining presence while the situation continued to define itself. Victoria spoke again, this time asking what would happen if the information required verification beyond what was immediately visible, and I answered that verification was not a challenge to validity, but a standard process that had already been anticipated and prepared for in advance. Her expression shifted slightly at that response, because it implied that resistance had already been accounted for before it could be expressed. Daniel looked up briefly, then back down, acknowledging without words that the usual arguments he might have relied on were no longer effective in this context. Around us, the lobby remained quiet, but the atmosphere had changed from observation to recognition, as if those listening understood that the situation was no longer uncertain in the same way it had been at the beginning. The receptionist, now standing a few steps away from the counter, kept her hands folded in front of her, no longer trying to interpret the situation through assumptions, only observing its progression. Victoria finally asked whether I expected immediate action, and I told her that immediate action was not the objective, but rather accurate acknowledgement followed by appropriate internal review according to established procedure. That distinction seemed to calm her slightly, not because the situation was resolved, but because it had entered a framework she understood professionally. Daniel then stated that if what I presented was fully valid, it would require escalation to senior review and legal confirmation, and I responded that such escalation had already been expected and was already supported by complete documentation prepared for that exact purpose. A long silence followed, not tense, but structured, as each person present processed the fact that the situation was no longer open-ended in the way it had initially appeared. Victoria eventually nodded. The meeting room on the upper floor was quieter than the lobby, but the silence carried a different weight, more formal and more restrained, as if the walls themselves were designed to contain uncertainty. Victoria Hale led the way inside with controlled steps, followed by Hale Brooks, while I entered last, not as an invited guest in the traditional sense, but as the subject of a process that had now moved beyond informal discussion. A long conference table stood in the center of the room, already prepared with additional copies of the documents I had previously presented. 2 senior administrators were present, seated with professional posture, their attention shifting between Victoria, Daniel, and myself without immediate judgment. Victoria began by summarizing the situation in measured terms, stating that a claim had been introduced requiring formal verification, and she carefully avoided language that implied either acceptance or rejection. Daniel added that preliminary review suggested complexity beyond standard internal review, emphasizing procedural caution rather than interpretation. I remained seated at the far end of the table, observing without interruption, because at this stage the process no longer required persuasion, only structure. One of the senior administrators asked me to confirm the origin of the documentation, and I explained clearly that the records were sourced from archived agreements and maintained records that had never been formally disputed in writing, only overlooked through time and organizational change. Victoria glanced toward me briefly when I said this, as if recognizing that the framing of the situation had shifted from personal disagreement to institutional responsibility. Daniel opened one of the folders placed on the table and reviewed the highlighted sections again, this time without speaking. His focus concentrated on alignment between dates, signatures, and recorded approvals. The second administrator asked whether I was seeking immediate enforcement or formal acknowledgement, and I clarified that my intention was structured acknowledgement followed by proper procedural action, not disruption of ongoing operations. That answer appeared to stabilize the direction of the discussion because it aligned with institutional process rather than emotional interpretation. Victoria then stated that she was prepared to initiate full internal verification with legal oversight included, and her tone carried less resistance than before, replaced by a professional acknowledgement that the matter could not remain unresolved. Daniel added that cooperation with external verification channels might be necessary depending on document authentication, and no one in the room disagreed. I noticed that the dynamic had changed significantly from earlier encounters in the lobby, where assumption and dismissal had shaped every response, to a controlled environment where each statement was measured against process rather than perception. The senior administrator concluded that the matter would proceed to full review and that all relevant historical records would be accessed and compared. Victoria acknowledged this formally, and Daniel followed with a brief confirmation, both now operating within the same procedural framework rather than opposing positions. I did not add further explanation, because at this stage explanation was no longer the driving force of movement. Instead, the documents themselves had become the central reference point guiding every decision. As the meeting came to a close, Victoria looked at me for a moment longer than before, not with resistance, but with recognition that the situation had already moved beyond the point of personal interpretation. Daniel closed the folder in front of him and placed it precisely in alignment with the others, signaling procedural containment rather than dismissal. I left the room last, understanding that the process had now transitioned fully from confrontation into formal validation, and that what remained was no longer question, but confirmation through established review. 2 weeks after the formal review process had begun, I was called back to Hale Brooks Corporate Center, but this time the atmosphere was noticeably different from the first day I walked through the front doors. There was no confusion in the lobby, no dismissive assumptions, only a quiet acknowledgement from staff who now recognized the situation as an active internal matter under senior review. The receptionist who had first spoken to me avoided unnecessary comments and simply directed me toward the executive elevator with professional neutrality. When I reached the upper floor, Victoria Hale was already waiting near the entrance to the conference area, her posture composed but her expression more reserved than before. Daniel Brooks stood a short distance away, holding a sealed envelope marked with internal review authorization codes, his focus directed forward rather than outward. Neither of them spoke immediately, and the silence between us was no longer filled with tension, but with expectation. I followed them into the same meeting room where the review process had previously been initiated. The senior administrators were already present, along with a legal representative and an external verification officer. The documents I had submitted earlier were now organized in a structured case file placed at the center of the table. One of the administrators began by stating that the verification process had been completed across all reference records, including archived agreements, internal transaction histories, and historical authorization logs. Victoria remained still as the summary continued, her hands resting on the table, her attention fully focused on each confirmed detail. Daniel reviewed the final report silently, his expression steady but no longer analytical in the same way as before, as if the need to question had already been replaced by understanding. The administrator then confirmed that the record supported the validity of my claim as originally presented, and that all relevant documentation aligned consistently across multiple independent sources. There was no dramatic reaction in the room, only a controlled acknowledgement of outcome within a professional setting. Victoria finally looked at me directly and asked for clarification regarding the next procedural steps, and I responded that all next steps would follow institutional policy, with no deviation from established legal and administrative standards. Daniel closed the report folder and placed it back on the table with careful precision, signaling that the review phase had concluded. The external verification officer confirmed that the findings would be formally recorded and submitted to executive compliance channels for final execution. Victoria nodded slowly, acknowledging the transition from review to resolution, her expression now reflecting acceptance rather than resistance. As I stood to leave the room, there was no further discussion required, because the purpose of my presence had already been fully realized through process rather than confrontation. Walking back through the corridor toward the elevator, I noticed that the environment no longer reacted to my presence in uncertainty or assumption, but in recognition of outcome. The building itself felt unchanged, yet the way it responded to me had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as dismissal had ended as acknowledgement, and what had once been questioned had now been formally confirmed through structure, documentation, and time.